Critical race theory, like any other academic discipline, is necessarily incomplete. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that those who critique the field, those who look at the evidence which marshals the arguments of the field with new eyes and a fresh analysis, allows for critical race theory to both deepen and expand its bounds. Now, why is this important? It is important because it allows for critical race theory to have a more concise and accurate analysis of law and how law comes to impact society and the persons in it as it simultaneously constitutes society. So, an example, those who study capital formation will say, hey, critical race theorist, we need for you to give a consideration to how both capitalism and race are co-constitutive and how that relationship is constituted by way of law. Well, in the same way, those who study gender make the same argument. And they say, hey, critical race theorists, we hear your argument about race in law, but the same is true of gender in law, and gender is missing from your analysis, and we need for you to take that up. Enter critical race feminism. But who are some of these people? There are people like E. Frances White, who in her text, The Dark Continent of Our Bodies, makes clear that we cannot understand race without gender, nor can we understand gender without race. But as a historian, how is E. Frances White marshaling this argument? She looks at early colonial laws such as partus sequitur ventrum, which means that which is born follows the womb. This was the legal concept that allowed for those who were born to enslaved women yet fathered by plantation owners to still be considered enslaved. In this particular example, not only does gender matter, as the property rights or the social status of one switched from their father to the mother if the mother was enslaved, but also only those persons who were black could be enslaved. And so in this way, race and gender are co-constitutive, and that we cannot understand race without gender, and we cannot understand gender without race. Accordingly, we turn our attention to critical race feminism as we understand the arguments, the experience, and the evidence that black women are marshaling, and that they are contributing to the field of critical race theory to say, hey, here is our experiences, and we need those experiences to be taken seriously. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture where we will be going over understanding the Combahee River collective statement. So let's go ahead and jump into our roadmap and make sure you have done the reading so that way you understand exactly where we are in the lecture. So what is our roadmap today? First of all, we're going to begin with the flashback as we always do. Then we're going to move on to understanding the context in which the statement itself is written. We're going to talk about the origins of contemporary black feminism. We're going to talk about the philosophy that comes up out of this statement that is written by the Combahee River Collective. We're going to talk about hurdles and organizing along the lines of black feminism. And then we're also going to talk about contemporary black feminist issues and projects. So with that stated, let's go ahead and get started. So by way of a flashback, we have covered quite a bit. We've covered the social contract. We've covered whiteness as property. We've also covered stand your ground laws. And what we understand is that stand your ground laws are an extension of whiteness as property, that it is seen as a right, an entitlement, a protection, a privilege, and that the whiteness as property is enshrined in law, that it is considered an intangible property that both accrues and retains values and extends rights to those who possess it. However, that whiteness as a form of property that is protected in law is only made possible because of the social contract, which itself is underwritten and guaranteed by the racial contract, right? So Charles Mills, Cheryl Harris, and Marcus Lee have given us an excellent foundation whereby which we can use as a point of departure to understand the Combahee River Collective statement. So as I stated, there are a number of critiques for any given academic field. And critique is what makes, universities, college spaces, academic spaces, racist, right? And along those lines, one of the critiques that is presented to critical race theory is the fact that, well, where are the women? As a matter of fact, just like there is the racial contract by Charles Mills, there is the sexual contract by Carol Pateman, right? Which talks about gender and how patriarchy also was a part of this social contract. And then they also wrote a book together. That is Carol Pateman and Charles Mills. But nonetheless, right, by way of critique is how we come to folks like Kimberly Crenshaw and many others who are in the field of critical race feminism. We are now making our turn into that area in understanding critical race feminism and the intervention or the contribution that they are making to the field of what? Critical race theory, so that the analysis of law in society is more complete and we understand where the issues are. So, by way of leaning in to Kimberly Crenshaw, what we're going to do is we are going over the Combahee River Collective statement first, so that we understand what are the issues that Black women are engaging with during this time, right? The Combahee River Collective statement is written in 1977. We know that CRT comes about in the 1980s. So what is it? What are the issues that Black women are engaging with? What problems are they finding in social movements? How are they encountering the nation state, etc.? And the Combahee River Collective statement gives us excellent context for setting us up for Kimberly Crenshaw's piece. So that is why we are engaging with the Combahee River Collective statement, so that we understand these issues, so that way when we dive into Kimberly Crenshaw and we do the analysis and critique of law, that our knowledge is more complete and we understand the depth to which it is coming from. So let's firstly begin with the context of the Combahee River Collective and what it is they are dealing with. Firstly, let's talk about the name, right? So the naming of the statement, indeed the group, compels us to remember the Combahee River Raid, right? Which was done by Harriet Tubman. This is the raid where she freed over 700 enslaved persons and at the same time leveled plantations in the process. So there was obviously a type of a reckoning that was happening here in society, right? This is Civil War times. Now, if the naming of the document in the group is any indication of the purpose to which this collective of Black women authored this piece, then one may reasonably conclude the end goal of their analysis and their insights is toward liberation. That the purpose that they are writing this out is to move a people more toward liberation, right? Secondly, we must also consider the wave of feminism in which this group of Black women are writing this piece. There are 4 waves of feminism. The first wave begins really in about the mid-1800s and takes us up to the 1920s. And that particular wave of feminism is really concerned with, watch this, property rights and voting rights for women. But during this time, we understand that there was an exclusion on what? Race. So those who came to have access to property rights and voting rights during this time were primarily who? White women. Then there is the second wave. The second wave really takes off during the 1960s and takes us up to the 1980s, right? So this includes civil rights era, the Black Power era, right? And what this wave of feminism is concerned about is equality and anti-discrimination. It's concerned about speaking out against both DV and SA. People who immediately come to mind, who are having very interesting moments in Black movement spaces, are people like Ella Baker, right? Who King would not let speak or be a part of decision making in the movement, so she starts a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So people like Ella Baker, people like Johnny Tillman, right? If you know folks who take advantage of SNAP benefits, right, that depend on those benefits, affordable housing, child care services, 4C, etc., WIC, you have Johnny Tillman to thank. People like Elaine Brown, who is the first woman to chair the Black Panthers. And then Reese Taylor, whose story you can read about in At the Dark End of the Street and what the movement fathers did to her. Right? And then there are folks also like Pauli Murray. Why am I bringing this up, and why is this important for the second wave of feminism? Because the second wave of feminism really takes place during this time in which black folks are pushing for rights. But as black folks are pushing for rights, black women are having a very particular experience. Here we go again. So the first wave of feminism, black women are having an experience because white women are centered within that wave. In the second wave of feminism, right, black women are having a particular experience because black men are leading the movements, right? And this is just what it is. So let's move to the third wave. And let's be very clear, within the second wave, before moving on, during the 1960s, we do see how black women come to be marginalized within these movements. Again, referencing folks like Ella Baker. Okay? So then we move on to the third wave of feminism, which takes place during the 1990s and the 2010s. And this is where we really see the attempted silencing of black women. However, what this era is about largely, and the themes that embrace it, is inclusivity, bodily autonomy, anti-essentialism. In other words, that there is no essential way to be a woman. That there are many different ways, right? And intersectionality. This is where Kimberly Crenshaw really begins to write. And of course, what women of color and black women are thinking about is possibilities, political possibilities, social possibilities, economic possibilities beyond what? White womanhood. But as it relates to the silencing of black women, who might we be thinking about in this era? Anita Hill. So we see where Anita Hill is dealing with SA, right? There is an issue with bodily autonomy and how men come together, both black and white, to silence Anita Hill's experience. We'll talk about that more in just a bit. And then there is the fourth wave of feminism, which we find ourselves in now. That is 2010s to present. And what is that wave of feminism? Like, what are the themes about? It is about consciousness raising via technology, i.e. social media, where we may not necessarily occupy the same geographic space, but we can still reach one another. This era is also about women's rights and equal pay, speaking out against SA and DV. It is also about increasing women leadership, shattering those glass ceilings, doing amazing amounts of consciousness raising in society. So one might think about Black Lives Matter and the 3 queer women who established Black Lives Matter. You might think about #MeToo, who was established by Tarana Burke. You might think of someone like a Ketanji Brown Jackson, who shatters the ceiling of the Supreme Court by being the first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. You might think of a Kamala Harris, right? Who's certainly not the first, but who was in the tradition of Shirley Chisholm in running for president, right? What's another theme that constitutes the fourth wave of feminism is organizing across difference. That is understanding each person's individual experience within the larger polity, right? So that we can understand how the construction of society impacts everyone at their particular social locale, so that we can better organize our efforts horizontally so that we can fight what? Vertically. And by organizing across difference, it helps us to understand that the struggle should not be with one another horizontally for power, but that the struggle should be upward, right? So it is within the second wave of feminism, because remember, the Combahee River Collective Statement is written in 1977. So it is within the second wave of feminism, that the Combahee River Collective Statement is written. And there are a number of things that are taking place that we need to make note of. Remember, the height of the civil rights movement was just over a decade ago at the time. What else is happening? The Black Power movement is waning. What else is going on? The National Welfare Rights Organization is beginning to face steep challenges, right? Because what is coming in? Jimmy Carter is in the White House, and what is he doing? He is restructuring the political and economic composition of the United States toward what? To neoliberalism. So the work that Johnny Tillman is doing with the National Welfare Rights Organization and the collective work that Black women are doing at this particular point in time is being challenged by neoliberalism. If you don't know what I'm referring to, make sure you check out week 3, lecture 1, so that you are clear on what neoliberalism is. It's covered within the first few minutes. So it is within this context that a group of Black women came together to work toward attaining life-sustaining resources and to be for themselves that which was not made available in both Black and white organizing spaces. Again, in Black movement spaces, Black women's voices were not taken seriously. Oftentimes, they were not engaged at all. And in most instances, Black women's voices were relegated to what? The periphery of movement decision making. Despite being the key group within the Black community doing the actual work of the movement. An example here, if we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, would be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in MLK. Study that closely, right? Because it is Black women who primarily make up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But who is it that's making the decisions? Who is it that's on the forefront? Right? These are things that we must think about and through. And that is what the Combahee River Collective statement is calling us to think about and to think through. Not necessarily to call one out, but to call one in and to think about our subject positions as we are located at our various social positions within the nation state. Now, on the other hand, within white feminist spaces, the specific issues Black women face by way of their race was ignored in favor of securing for white women the same privileges, benefits, protections, and entitlements of who? White men, right? So it is within this space that the collective is coming together. This group of Black women are coming together and writing this statement. Now let's apply this by way of example, by thinking through and about Anita Hill's experience. And here's where critical race feminism is going to lean in and give us some sharp analysis, some incisive analysis here. So remember, it is Joe Biden who makes the decision not to allow Anita Hill's witnesses to testify. Anita Hill, or all of her witnesses to testify. Anita Hill's lived experience with Clarence Thomas in the workplace, by way of Joe Biden, is wholly circumvented in service of what? Further reinforcing the authority of the nation state. That's one. Number 2, the socio-political power of Joe Biden as a senator. Number 3, the judicial patriarchal power of Clarence Thomas. And number 4, the cloak of femininity bequeathed to Jenny Thomas, who is Clarence Thomas's wife. So, more directly, a critical race feminist approach to what took place with Anita Hill would argue that Anita Hill is silenced precisely because Jenny Thomas, as a white woman, must not be made to endure any more than what she has already endured, and that her property rights in whiteness be recognized. Again, go back to that first wave of feminism. Catch it, right? So, in other words, what this type analysis, what a critical race feminist analysis is necessarily arguing is that Joe Biden, in seeing Jenny Thomas's marriage to Clarence Thomas as he's sitting on the dais and observing them, that he made a decision to silence Anita Hill precisely because Jenny Thomas was already exposed to the burden of blackness in her daily life by way of her marriage to Clarence Thomas. So then, Biden leverages the power of law and judicial procedure in service of white womanhood made possible by way of the injury of a black woman and the invisibilization of a black woman Her name being Anita Hill. Do you all see the incisive analysis that is able to take place there? So what critical race feminism is doing is expanding our capacity to understand the impact of law and legal processes and how that helps us to understand the socio-political context in which we live. So it is within this context like Anita Hill, that the privatization of public services, the invisibilization of black women in the public sphere, and the relegation of black women in black movement spaces, as well as women-centered movement spaces, it is in the context of all of this that the Combahee River Collective writes this statement. So with all that being laid out, what are the 4 areas of focus that these black women come together and lean in on? What is it that they unpack? They ask us to understand the origins of contemporary black feminism, their philosophy as black women, where they're coming from, how this comes about. They're asking us to take up a consideration of the hurdles that they face in organizing along the lines of black feminism. And then they also want us to be aware of contemporary black feminist issues and projects, right? So let's take each one of these in turn. First, by starting with the origins of black feminist thought. Firstly, what these black women make clear is that black women's relationship to the socio-political public of the U.S. has always been one that is contentious and antithetical to the project that is the nation. And this is so because of the intersection of race and gender. A little bit of foreshadowing here to Kimberly Crenshaw. What this collective of black women are getting at here is that the development of the Western world that Charles Mills was talking about, right, has placed black women at both a specific and particular location in society by way of the social contract, which itself is underwritten by what? The racial contract. And that because of this contract, their lives are the tangible collateral whereby which the contract is enacted, and whiteness as property is both made possible and expanded in service of who? White womanhood. Sit with it. Right? This particular insight is important. Why? It is important because in the first wave of feminism, combined with the arguments of Ruth Bader Ginsburg before the Supreme Court in the 1970s, so what RBG is doing in the Supreme Court in the 70s maps onto the same time frame in which this letter is being written, right? That the first wave of feminism and what RBG is doing in the Supreme Court, these worlds collide. These waves collide to do what? To map white women onto U.S. society as well as the polity of the U.S. Now, while one may argue that the mapping of white women onto society is not complete and there is still work to be done, in which case there is, in this specific instance, as with whiteness as property, these particular rights that have now been ascribed to white women by way of the first wave of feminism, the arguments that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is making before the Supreme Court, that these particular rights ascribed to white women as a result of the movement work, as a result of the jurisprudence, does not necessarily guarantee they will win. But like whiteness is property, as Cheryl Harris has taught us, it does guarantee that they will not lose. It is from this framing that black feminism has its origins in the late 1960s. Speaking to the experience of both black women and women of color who were in both black movement spaces as well as feminist spaces. However, when the remedies were provided via the courts, black women were not included within those remedies. That's something to think about. That's something to think through. So as a result, what begins to happen? Black women formed their own groups. Own groups like what? The National Black Feminist Organization, as well as the National Welfare Rights Organization, right? While white women, on the other hand, went on to form and further expand socio-political groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, as well as Christian nationalist groups like the Seven Mountain Mandate, which was made possible in part by way of the work of Lauren Cunningham's wife, Darlene Cunningham, who worked closely with the youth arm, Youth with a Mission. Why? Because they were now guaranteed access to their whiteness as property, which was guaranteed by way of the social contract. What is the point here in understanding the origins of contemporary black feminism and where it comes from? The whole point here is that by way of their exclusion, by way of black women's exclusion and marginalization in both movement spaces, in black movement spaces and women-centered movement spaces, black women formed their own organizations because they were excluded and erected a philosophy that was born of exclusion and lived experience. Now that we have that down, let's talk about the philosophy, right? In terms of what's the structure that's upholding contemporary black feminism, right? What's informing it? So what shaped and guided black feminist organizing space for black women during this time was the fact that black women advanced that they were, and we're in the piece now, right? That they were, quote, inherently valuable. We're in the reading. That their liberation, black women's liberation, is a necessity and not as an adjunct to someone else's. In other words, that they just happen to be free because another group would get free. That black women are saying in this piece, the Combahee River Collective Statement, that we are valuable and that we deserve our liberation, our freedom on our own terms. In other words, black men were able to pursue rights and make a claim on the nation state, but for them being what? Black. So then discrimination protections kicked in, albeit not evenly. And similarly, white women were able to pursue rights and make a claim on the nation state as well, but for them being women, right? So then discrimination protections kick in for them as well, again, albeit not evenly. What is the caveat here? Because remember, just like critical race theory is grounded and centered in law, critical race feminism is also grounded and centered in law. What is the caveat? Law does not permit the acknowledgement of a compound injury. An example, race and gender. It has to be this or that. This is going to be really important when we get to Kimberly Crenshaw, right? So that means that black women either have to make a claim via race if they're bringing a discrimination suit, or a claim via gender. However, white women, right, speak for gender. Black men in this instance speak for race. But is there a specific injury? Is there a specific lived experience that black women are having that are not able to be adequately represented by each group independently? The answer to that question is yes. So then what does this result in? It results in black women's social and political recognition, as it was prevented by law, came to be wholly dependent on those of either class, black men or white women. And to the extent that either group made an effort to include black women, black women's liberation was both limited and subjected to the whims of someone else. In other words, that the rights and recognitions of those groups were made possible by way of the subjugation of black women. And here in this statement, black women are saying what? That we are inherently valuable and that our liberation is a necessity and should be centered and not dependent upon someone else to make that possible for ourselves, leaving us subject to them in their whims and whatever it is they want to do in the movement on whatever given day. So, what happens? Black feminist organizing, here goes the philosophy, rejected this particular approach in law. There is the critical part of it. And thus their unique social positioning became the experience from which the philosophy of black feminism is established. So then black feminism is not only a response to social movements, it is also a response to judicial exclusion. Accordingly, what begins to happen here? Popularized racial tropes and patriarchal ideals such as mammy, sapphire, submissive, obedient, etc. were what? Challenged and refused as black women did what? They carved out their own identity for who? Themselves. It is within this vein that the Combahee River Collective also comes to do what? Reject the Western world conceptualization of heterosexism. Now here we go, right? We're beginning to expand and push. Here goes how critical race feminism begins to push on the bounds of critical race theory, because they're saying, hold up. It's not just gender, it's not just race, it's not just class. It is also the particular ways in which the nation state is dependent upon heterosexism and the ways in which women become further subjugated by way of the demand of heterosexism. So what is it that the Combahee River Collective is going to say here? Their critique is this: that we understand that within the framing of the nation state, that women's bodies are for the production, use, and sustainability of the nation state by way of doing what? Birthing children. By the way, this is where reproductive rights has the debate. This is what it drives right to the center of. That because the nation state obviously needs a populace to maintain itself, right? Then the bodies of women are positioned as being made subject to the nation state. And this is one of the arguments that is made in Carol Pateman's The Sexual Contract, by the way. That women's bodies are positioned to be in service to the nation state and therefore subjected to the whims of patriarchal structural arrangement. However, the Combahee River Collective not only centered and insisted upon bodily autonomy, but also recognized and centered the various forms of one's what? Sexual orientation. Do you all see the freedom that's breaking out here, right? That is happening. That is allowing one's full personhood to come into sharp relief, and how they are pushing on and challenging the Western world in its conceptualizations. In other words, challenging John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? You should be thinking Charles Mills week 1, right? So they are challenging the Western conceptual norms, which Mills articulates as being animated by what? White supremacy via the racial contract that makes the social contract possible, that makes whiteness as property possible, that extends rights such as what? Stand your ground. By way of this, the black women of the Combahee River Collective centered their experiences in forming their philosophy and the philosophy of contemporary black feminism. And they say this, they say, quote, "We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression." Who does this sound like? Come on in the room, 92%. The 92%, right? So what's happening here with the Combahee River Collective? They are saying that we reject what? Pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. And they go on to say, well, this is a direct quote from the reading. They say, to be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. In other words, they are saying that in centering themselves and their experiences, that they are taking care of themselves, that they don't necessarily need to be placed on a pedestal, but to recognize them as human is enough. What does that mean? To get behind the organizing efforts of. What does that mean? That means that when you've been given all the facts about candidates and what could happen, but yet you choose to vote in a different direction, that makes black women in this instance rendered as non-persons within the political sphere, and accordingly, spaces are erected, spaces of care, spaces of love, spaces of healing, because by way of certain socio-political activities, i.e. voting in this example, and we're talking about the 92%, you were okay with rendering black women as non-persons within the polity. And accordingly, what happens? That the 92%, along with those of the Combahee River Collective, believe that the most effective politics comes directly out of their own identity and experience, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression, because they had already tried that in the first wave of feminism, in the second wave of feminism, in the third wave of feminism, and here we are in the fourth wave of feminism, and the same thing is still happening. In other words, for the black women of the Combahee River Collective, as well as the 92%, I would argue, the personal is political. So, by way of their social positioning, black feminist politics challenge the prevailing political economic systems, i.e. capitalism, heterosexism, racism, sexism in and of itself, imperialism, biodeterminism, and patriarchy. In other words, by generating a politics from their specific social locale, black women are clear their liberation meant the liberation of everyone else. Do you see how critical race feminism gets down to a more incisive analysis? This is what black feminist politics is getting toward, and this is the philosophy. So what is important to underscore here is that black women of the Combahee River Collective erected a politics and social approach that is born of experience and not one of inclusion in what they deem to be an inherently violent and exclusionary nation state. Now, who does this sound like? It sounds like Cheryl Harris. It sounds like Derek Bell. It sounds like Charles Mills. That they are not theorizing on aspirations of being included in the polity, but they are theorizing and erecting a community of care based in what? Lived experience. So then what are some of the problems that they begin to run into in organizing along the lines of black feminism, which should, by the way, be, well, it does have significant implications for those of us who do not identify as black women in terms of the work that we could be doing. So what are some of the problems that that they identify in this letter that black feminist organizing is running into? They say, they lean into the fact that as with all movements and philosophies, that they, the Combahee River Collective, faced challenges. That as they organized against racial, gendered, heteronormative, and class subjectivities and privileges, there were those in the movement who were inconsistent. Right? Along with this, now y'all stay with me. Along with this were black men who did not support the efforts of black women who sought to stand in their own light. Why? Because the colliding of both gender and capitalism privileged black men and rendered them as men in a society that would not otherwise acknowledge their being. Therefore, their social recognition was predicated upon the subjugation of black women. Now, come on, brothers. This is where we have to rethink what it means to be a man. What are the socio-political mechanisms that inform that? And to the extent that we wish to be that, how's that further marginalize and or silence the lives of black women who we are in community with? We really have to think through and about that. So it is in this way, in thinking through about this collision of gender and race, that the subjection of black women become paramount to black men having political efficacy. And if this is the means by which we can have, that if this is the only means by which we can have political efficacy, that means that we have to redo some things. That the liberation of a people cannot simply be white power in black hands, that we repeat the same harms that have been done by men who are white historically, right? And the same is true, by the way, of white women, with the exception that it was the colliding of race and capitalism that made their worlds possible. So we have to begin to think about and through these things. So accordingly, organizing along the lines of black feminism became difficult because the construction of the Western world that we learned about week 1 with Charles Mills and the dictates of the social contract position black women's material lives, the resources that they have access to, right? Wholly dependent upon the precarious tension between capitalism, race, and gender. It constituted what? A vector of violence. Therefore, in many instances, organizing against these issues is made difficult. Why? Because these particular areas, capitalism, race, and gender, make possible the material needs that black women need in order to live. They constitute life-sustaining resources, and to push against that means something for their lives. In closing, let's look at black feminist issues and projects. What is it that black feminists are taking up? What is it that they are working on as we close out here? So even with all of this stuff that I've covered, the Combahee River Collective still sought to be of service to themselves because they were clear that no one was coming to assist them. Right? What did Malcolm X say about black women? Look it up. Right? And importantly, what Malcolm X said about black women did not exclude black men from participating in what he said. Right? But nonetheless. So that they were clear that no one was coming to assist them. What did they do? They started child care services. They organized for reproductive rights. They demanded health care. They demanded SA crisis centers. They demanded that DV be addressed, and many, many, many more things. The point of black women who were part of the Combahee River Collective was to make the lived experiences of black women clear, and that these experiences were brought into being not only by way of the social contract and the dictates of whiteness as property that required black women's marginality, but also because of the confines of what? law, along with black men's and white women's insistence upon being rendered as cognizable in a society at the expense of black women. That is the whole point that the Combahee River Collective Statement is getting toward, right? And keep it in mind, we're still within the frame of critical race feminism here. So law is still centered as we are addressing these various areas. So then law, what is the one of the tenets of critical race feminism then? It is so that as law makes particular groups visible and guarantees their 14th Amendment rights, that it marginalizes others, in this instance, black women, and causes their dispossession in non-personhood. Remember that Black Women Venture Capitalist Fund? This is what black women are talking about, right? So this is the importance of the Combahee River Collective Statement, and understanding all of this background and context, so that as we lean into Kimberly Crenshaw, the implications are clear, and so that you have a holistic view. With that being stated, this is today's lecture. I'll see you next time. Peace.